something identified in the Bloomberg story that Isabel was just discussing is that all of this has been happening in an environment where we have an administration and policymakers who are perceived to be more supportive of the underlying technology and the industry than prior administrations. Why would this movement and this market action happen, therefore, in that environment?
Well, Isabel pointed to the maturation of Bitcoin, and while we have a very friendly administration, a lot of that was priced into that run-up that we saw to the 126,000. And we're really seeing Bitcoin act more like a risk asset these days, rather than that digital gold narrative that we saw in the earlier days of Bitcoin. And I'd also point to, there's a market structure bill, previously known as the Clarity Act, that is still under consideration in the Senate. So that has not moved as quickly as those of us in the industry had hoped. And I think that's causing a little uncertainty around what the guardrails around Bitcoin and other crypto assets are going to be.
The words that Isabel Lee just outlined are ringing in my head. What is this? Is this structural or is this philosophical? That is one of the great sound bites. Good job, Isabel. But it is a question that comes up a lot. Maybe we should phone David Sachs and ask him, to your point, about the progress of this bill. But again, you mentioned the structural part. What is the philosophical part Isabel was alluding to?
Well, the philosophical part, and I've been invested in the sector since 2013, is in the early days, you had a lot of long-term holders, people who believed in the self-sovereign currency, the self-sovereign asset that was not controlled by any government, and was particularly useful to those people in hyperinflationary environments. So that's where that digital gold narrative came, where it was be a hedge. And what we've seen now, and as Isabel said, it could be a victim of its own success. I don't quite say it's a victim quite yet, but we're seeing more institutional holding. And so the institutions have determined that this will be more of a risk asset. It will trade more in tune with assets like the tech stocks, not commodities. And so that's where that philosophical divide has happened. It's great that we have more institutions. We have more acceptance of the sector of Bitcoin as an asset class, but it may not hold as that digital gold narrative, or it may hold as that narrative in emerging markets and not in developed markets.
Jalak, does that matter to your investments? Were you building on Bitcoin as the OG and as rails to future infrastructure? Are you broader thinking, actually, we don't need Bitcoin in and of itself to remain a buy and hold asset? I'm more interested in the underlying technology, to use an overused phrase. I'm more interested in the stable coin side of the equation.
Right. When I first saw Bitcoin, I was really interested in it as a self-sovereign currency, having been raised in emerging markets. However, I was even more excited by blockchain technology. So this concept of having data or assets on chain that could create more efficiency in the trading of data. So if we're going to step away and look at AI, and we look at AI agents, and for them to communicate and transact with each other, it's much more efficient if they can do it in an on-chain environment. Now, that's much further in the future. We're starting to see tokenized securities. We're starting to see real-world assets, so private credit going on-chain. We're seeing money market funds go on-chain. And we're going to continue to see already regulated assets moving on-chain. ICE from the New York Stock Exchange has talked about their initiatives around tokenized equities. So that's all happening, regardless of what happens to the Bitcoin price. So we're really seeing the financial infrastructure being rebuilt by blockchain technology, which also powers Bitcoin. I don't think either is going away. I think we just have to separate the two. And of note, stable coins, which are run on chain, those were regulated by the Genius Act, which passed last year, and then we've seen a proliferation of activity in that sector because of that regulation.
Do you continue to call yourself a crypto first VC briefly, or do you become an AI VC?
Well, our thesis has always been around the intersection of blockchain, crypto assets, and AI forming the basis of the next internet. And we've seen the development of these different areas at different times. I think they're all very important to our future. I think that crypto side may take a bit longer to really, form or validate itself in that narrative.